Before we begin our discussion of the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the US-UAE 123 agreement, I'd like to ask you to join me in watching a short video from the Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation, which will provide a background on the civil nuclear program in the United Arab Emirates.
The United Arab Emirates is growing. And to grow, we need energy. Clean, efficient, reliable electricity for our families and for our environment. ENEC is leading the development of the UAE Peaceful Nuclear Energy Program, safely and efficiently generating electricity in line with national regulatory requirements and the highest international standards. This is nuclear energy. The energy to create jobs, the energy to build communities, the energy to create a sustainable future.
So now I'd like to invite our panelists to join me on stage. First, His Excellency Mohamed Al-Hammadi, the Chief Executive Officer of the Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation. Welcome. His Excellency directs the deployment of nuclear energy plants in the UAE, and he has served as the General Manager of the Federal Electricity and Water Authority and served with the Mubadala Development Company. Next, I'd like to invite Dan Poneman to join us. Dan is President and CEO of Centrus Energy Corporation and served as the Deputy Secretary of Energy from 2009 to 2014.
Please. Okay.
The US-UAE 123 agreement is rightly heralded as one of the best examples of international civil nuclear cooperation, both at the government and corporate levels. I'd also like to highlight that it's a great example of bipartisan agreement within US politics, which can seem to be a rare thing. It began at the very end of the George W. Bush administration, and it was finalized by the Obama administration, and it also enjoys strong support from the current administration. So now it's been 10 years since the agreement, and we are very fortunate to have each of you here to reflect on this anniversary and on the US-UAE 123 agreement. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you to tell us just a little bit about where you each were and the role that you each played in that agreement 10 years ago. Your Excellency.
After you.
First of all, thank you for having me here. I'm very honored and pleased to be speaking to distinguished guests, and also to be sitting next to Don Poneman here, and also, Jennifer. My involvement was in the early days of the project. We had, in 2006, a comprehensive study on the energy needs for the country, and at that time, we looked at all energy sources, and the UAE has been growing, from an economical and also industrial, in a very fast pace. We had double digits of growth in annual electricity consumption in the UAE in the last 10 years. And we looked, it was in 2006 and 2007, how things will look like by 2020 from demand on electricity. So we looked at all available resources in the country, and they said that's not enough to meet that demand. So what do we have as an options? So we looked at renewable, and Masdar was established. We looked at the coal and nuclear and the gas, and we started evaluating the options of how do we can make civilian nuclear power plants work for the nation, because nuclear technology is safe, reliable, and provide abundant electricity for decades, and US and other countries are benefiting from that source of energy. So that were things were started. So how we can build a civilian nuclear power plant that can provide electricity in safe, reliable, and abundant to the nation growth. And that's where we started. And the government issued in 2008 a policy paper stating the key principles for the country, how we'll develop this. We are committed to the highest standard of nuclear safety, security, highest standards non-proliferation, and we've shared that policy. Was published in 2008 in April as the key principles, and that policy paper was translated to law in the country, and that also established our regulator. We have Mr. Rahul here from our Federal Authority of Nuclear Regulation. So that set the stage for how the UAE will develop this program for the next 60 years plus.
And Dan?
Well, first of all, thanks to the Atlantic Council, to you, Jennifer, and it's always a pleasure to be with my friend and colleague, Mohamed Hammadi. My story tracks Mohamed's, and we didn't plan it, but my first introduction, I just see Seth Gray is out there, is right around the same time of that 2006 study, and actually in a way that's emblematic of everything they've done with the program ever since. They were very focused on being thoughtful and thorough and doing diligence. And I had served by that time for 6 years at the National Security Council, working on nuclear issues, nonproliferation, and so forth. And they came and they said, just as Mohamed has laid out here, we have tremendous baseload needs coming up. We don't have an installed infrastructure. I didn't hear much about renewables, but they were looking at both coal and nuclear at that point. And they had opted for nuclear. Masdar was already a great vision that they had. They were already very bearish on carbon. They were ahead of the game on that one. And in the discussions that we were having in Washington at that time, I was out of government. I was working with General Scowcroft, another great expert on national security. We noted, which is something the Emiratis themselves knew very well, that it was a very dangerous neighborhood and that people would be focused on the nonproliferation aspect of it. And our Emirati colleagues said, well, we want electricity, not anything else. And so they went through this very thorough process. As Mohamed said, they wrote a very thoughtful white paper. And that white paper made clear, and back in 2008, that given the size of their program and their commitment to only peaceful purposes, that they would rely on the commercial market globally for the fuel services, separation of plutonium, which they weren't pursuing anyway, but spent fuel treatment, and uranium enrichment. That was a logical thing to do, and they sought advice from all over, and I think they got consistent advice, and I think they took a very wise decision. I was watching that very impressive video up front, and I would note that they made the same decisions on the safety side that they made on the national security side, and you saw the references to the World Association for Nuclear Operators and INPO and so forth. So from the very outset, they were committed to doing this in a thoughtful, thorough, and transparent way.
Thank you. Your Excellency, how does this agreement advance the UAE's energy security and decarbonization goals?
So the current plans of the UAE was initiated in 2006 and 2007. We looked at all the environment. We looked at the growth of the UAE and how the current resources at that time will not meet the demand, and we looked for cleaner sources of energy. So renewable and nuclear, are the options. We discounted coal at that time, and the growth, as I said, double digits. So today, the nuclear power plants, we are supposed, hopefully will be, I'm very confident that we operate them soon to the high standard nuclear safety. That will, once we have the 4 units operation, that will prevent, emitting around 21 million tons of CO2 emissions. 21 million tons of CO2, that's a major for the UAE size as a country. And that's just put things in perspective. These are equivalent to our 3.2 million cars off the road. And that's a major change for the energy mix for the UAE. And per capita, this will change the consumption, the consumption or the emissions, per capita for the country. So that's the way I see it. Other than the benefits, in human capital, industrial development, this industry, what we've seen also in the US and also in Korea and other nations, you have 1 to 6, for every employee you have within the business of the civil nuclear business, you have 6 people supporting in the private sector and government sector and all that. That also creates highly paid jobs. It's a very high caliber industry, requires highly competent people who will be paid also highly. as people from in the industry. Secondly, also enhances the supply chain. I was at dinner last night with, hosted by Seth, and the nuclear industry, any country it happens, it does upgrade the industries, makes the standards much higher for quality management, safety, you name it. And when our regulator was established, Federal Authority of Nuclear Regulation, FANR, they collected all the regulations and they reinforced the regulations across all the sectors, healthcare, our business, and other business. And that did raise the standards for every infrastructure in the country. Export control. That also reinforces all our export controls because we're applying the highest standards when it comes to the export control of the nation. So that did upgrade the country, including security, as Dan mentioned, the human capital development. But going back specifically on the environmental side, I do see this project will change the UAE environmental footprint and CO2 footprint, and will position UAE as a leader in the industry. Looking back 10 years ago, and a couple of years down the road, UAE emissions would have dropped dramatically because of these 4 units. As I mentioned this morning, this power plant is in 1 kilometer in size, will provide 25% of electricity for the nation, and will avoid us emitting 20 million tons of CO2 emission. That's huge compared to a journey of only 12 to 13 years.
And Dan, speaking geopolitically, what does this agreement accomplish for US-UAE relations?
Well, I think you have to understand, Jennifer, that for the U.S. to enter into significant level of nuclear cooperation with another nation, we require under our Atomic Energy Act of 1954 what's called an agreement for peaceful nuclear cooperation, known by the section of the law as the Section 123 agreement. So when the United States enters into a relationship of that character, it's really testimony to the overall strength of the relationship and to the confidence that each side has in the other. So when one enters into a nuclear supply relationship with another nation, it's really a century-long commitment because you have the planning phase, you have the construction phase, the reactor will operate for several decades, and the decommissioning and so forth. So I would say the relationship was already strong, but I think that this cooperation has strengthened it. When I had the opportunity to serve as Deputy Secretary of Energy, we started a US-UAE energy dialogue with His Excellency Minister Suhail Al-Mazroui. We visited the people who were being trained to do security, who were training with our people at the U.S. Department of Energy. And what happens is you have personal relationships and bonds that are formed that really last and extend far beyond the four corners of the relationship in the nuclear sphere itself. And I would just note, for example, that when we had a number of challenges during the time I did serve at the U.S. Department of Energy, whether it was the Libyan oil crisis or whatever, that we had a very robust and strong dialogue with our Emirati colleagues, and I think it was all informed by the fact that we had this very close relationship in this area that is really, in global terms, of great geostrategic significance.
Jennifer, if I might add, I think the 123 agreement, as Dan mentioned, if I put things in sequence, when we had the policy paper published by the UAE of the highest commitment to nuclear safety, security, nonproliferation, and that policy paper was translated into law. And these principles were also embedded in the bilateral agreement, with 123 agreement with the US, with UK, France, Korean, and with similar principles. What I, having this discussion here, commend the US in helping us in our program. That made the relationship much easier. Exchange of knowledge, expertise, people, that did open the door in the bilateral, cooperation between the two countries, between the UAE and US. And I think that's what the most benefit of the 123 agreement between the UAE and the US. So that's why this, as a tool, as a legal tool, enabled the pathway of cooperation between the two countries. I remember when we used to work with the US, we was doing the A10 process. It's a very complex process, but once you went into 123 agreement, it made relationship and exchange of knowledge and expertise much more efficient and effective manner.
Yeah, and if I might just add, because very good point, Mohamed, it actually goes far beyond the four corners of a bilateral relationship, because if you look back at the excellent presentation Fatih Birol gave earlier in the day, and you saw that there's absolutely no way that the world is going to reach anything close to either 2 degrees, much less 1.5 degrees temperature rise, without a robust deployment of nuclear. Really, the case we have here in the UAE is a great example of how, in just 10 years, it's really incredible, you can go from a standing start, not cut any corners, bring in the full regulatory expertise, internalize it, Emiratize it, and bring in the security forces, top technology, top suppliers, and actually get power to the grid. And this is actually, I think, a model for others to follow. And if we can get this kind of advancement in other countries, I think we have at least a shot at closing that gap on 2 degrees centigrade.
So I'm going to push a little bit further on that and ask, given that we have this great example of cooperation between the US and UAE, assuming that there are other countries that wish to also enter into bilateral agreements, what are some lessons learned, and then how do we apply those lessons elsewhere? And that is to each of you.
Okay, I'm giving you this one. Yes? Oh. He's the ex-government official of the US.
Well, look, I think that, and actually this begins to get in the direction of the excellent paper, Jennifer, that you just wrote on co-financing. I think the implication here is when you start from a premise of looking at the base objective of how much baseload power you need to bring to the people and compare your alternatives, and you find that nuclear is a useful way to close this gap, I think really we've got a roadmap here in how the Emiratis went about it, in very patiently starting with a policy review. I commend to anyone to read the excellent white paper of 2008. They then codified that in legislation in 2009. They trained the people extensively, and I think really it's a cookbook on how to do this right. And frankly, at a time when 30 additional nations are looking at developing nuclear energy, I think it's a great case study, and one that can inspire confidence that you can actually not only dream of such a program, but actually, if you're thoughtful and thorough about it, but you can execute it. But the key thing, I would say, the key takeaway in the Emirati case is don't cut corners. And for example, they were very thoughtful when they finished the actual construction of Unit 1 to get the training they needed for the operators to make sure that they could operate it safely and so forth. And I think that's going to be critical. Never to cut corners, and it's always good to be on time and on budget, but you got to make sure that safety and security come first.
So from my side, I would say a thorough planning. When it comes to the original initiation phase of the project, we did a lot of thorough thinking, identifying the areas of opportunities for improvement. At that time, 2008, we didn't have a regulator in the country, a nuclear regulator. So a regulator was set up independently, reporting to the highest authority in the government of the UAE, and that was lessons learned from the US. As the NRC reports to the highest authority in the government, same thing in the UAE. Our regulator reports to the highest authority in the government of the UAE. So you have the authority to shut the power plants if they don't see it operating safely. We took a very systematic approach in developing our human capital, process, procedure, bylaws, laws in the government, in a very systematic approach. We had a roadmap document that has around over 1,800 activities explaining the work and putting the work and codifying that work for the next 150 years until we decommission the plants and how we even decommission them. And today, I'm very proud to say that we managed to do this in a very systematic approach. We took always the highest standard of safety, security, and safety and transparency in our each step we took in our journey, and we've done it in to high standards. And just to, if you are interested in to look at how transparent is the program, if you look to the website of our regulator, every issue, it is in their website, and how it's been addressed, and how it's been challenged, and how it's been deliberated between the utility and the regulator in our website. I've never seen that level of transparency. I've seen it actually in the US, where it's also been useful for us when a country does this, in a transparent manner, and they share their lessons learned, and they share their challenges, it makes their lessons learned become global. And we've learned from the US, where the US have reached when it comes to the standards of the civil nuclear power plant business. And we take it, we adopted it, and we did train our people to become qualified in this industry, because nuclear industry, it is a national responsibility. You have a nuclear power plants, you are responsible for them. Another lessons learned we had, and I'm very proud of, is that we were able to commercially finance our power plants. We managed to get loans from private banks and also government banks to finance the project. This was unheard of to develop nuclear power plants. Everybody says they will be behind schedule, they will be over budget. We proved we could do this with good project management, with good skills and high talent and qualified people, and also tapping into the international expertise. We managed to do it. So as to your point, we have, humbly I could say, a good example that we could share with other nations who are interested to do this in the same way we've done it.
Wonderful. Well, please join me in applauding this momentous anniversary. And please join me also in thanking our panelists, Mr. Hammadi and Dan Poneman. And this concludes the first day of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Forum, in which we are setting the energy agenda for 2020. And the main themes that came out of today, in my mind, are using clean energy to meet increasing global energy demand, and how each energy source can participate in that energy transition through decarbonization and the diversification of the energy sector. We've also discussed the dynamics of the energy transition in our region in focus, South and Southeast Asia. And we've highlighted in these last few sessions finding pathways to net zero. So thank you for joining us today, and please return and join us tomorrow for our second day of the forum. A quick announcement on logistics. Due to the weather, we are no longer going to be holding the reception and dinner in the Azura Cafe. So instead, we will reconvene back here in this room at 7 o'clock for a reception and dinner, but please proceed immediately outside for refreshments. And then at 9:30, please join us for our night owl session, which will be the Greta Effect, Global Responses to the Climate Crisis, and it will be held on the first floor in the Al Khazna breakout room. Thank you very much.